All right, here
Woohoo.
we are talking about coaching. So, as I'm here with Nikki and Sevas. Hello, guys.
Hey.
Nikki, I wish you so much luck with your flooded basement. You're in a cafe. We have a little bit of background noise.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate you, despite the odds, making it. Good. Well, we have an interesting question and one that is more present than usual. Just because I had a recent conversation with Julie Starr for the Coaching Uncaged podcast, who wrote. Many of you will know her as the author of the Coaching Manual. And part of what we talked about was getting the ego out of the way when we're coaching, and it's a topic that often pops up particularly when I supervise, also when I coach myself or I supervise myself, or when I just have conversations with people. Sometimes you show up and your ego just gets in the way, which incidentally happened when I met Julie for the first time at a conference. I won't go into the whole story, but I kept saying things that were just not helpful at all. And I'm like, why am I saying these things? And it was totally my ego getting in the way, trying to kind of level somewhere where I wasn't present anymore as much as I could. And I have that a lot in supervision. Clients find themselves in coaching sessions and they start getting defensive, or they doubting whether they ask a question, or they ask a question in order to show how much they know, or they interrupt the client with a comment that wasn't necessary. It was only to feed their ego in some way, right? To prove that they've listened very, very well, or to showcase a piece of knowledge, or to mention that they know the person that this person is talking about because I don't know, whatever it might be. It just stops us from being present. While we're asking ourselves, is this a good question? Is this a great coaching question? Or am I doing it right? Or am I doing well enough? Or, should I challenge more or less? Am I a good enough coach right now? Am I doing it right? It's not helpful because it distracts us. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot more where that came from, but I wanted to pause there for a moment to see if the context is clear enough and what you guys think.
Yeah, I like this. I think this is something that there's a few things that came up straight away for me. I noticed that in the past this would happen for me, especially, and I'm sure it still happens. I don't think I'm perfect from this, but it would often happen when I was trying to impress the client. Mm-hmm. And so the thing that I wrote down is impressing versus really making a difference, versus really focusing on coaching the person. And this would often more happen in enrollment conversations. But I think, like, if I get really present to it, it would often it would also happen in coaching relationships. But then the focus underneath that was either trying to look good or trying to impress the person. Mm-hmm. Right. And actually the moment I start practicing letting that go, just start really focusing on just being a good coach, and really not being attached to, am I saying the right thing here, or how do I look if I go this direction and it might be the wrong direction, right? And this is kind of connected to another distinction, is that I often remind myself of, I think, is it pleasing versus serving, right? I could say something that could please the client, right? And it could, again, make me look good, or it could avoid me looking bad, or I could go really into service, which potentially could be challenging, could be uncomfortable, could even create a bit more friction in the relationship.
Can you think of an example from your recent coaching work?
Let me sit with that for a second and then come back to you. But yeah, I think the main thing is, well, what comes up is not so much recently. What would come up often is this. I think you mentioned that about showing how much I know, mm-hmm. right? Or sometimes just inserting things that don't really actually matter in that conversation, right? For example, if somebody wants help with something, I think there's a balance between what really serves this conversation and what am I trying to insert, so to just show like, hey, I'm an expert here, or you should work with me because I have all of this here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So for me, like in the past, what's come up is just sometimes inserting saying, yeah, actually, I've recently done this with someone, or I've helped so many, like 5 people like yourself or 10 people like yourself. And from time to time, I think it could be useful to somebody share, like to ask permission, say, hey, would it be okay if I share with you something that I've recently done? But again, I think it's very much the context between like, why am I going here? Is it really in service to the conversation, or am I just sharing it to impress or to show this person that I can help you? I'm the expert here.
Yeah, it makes me think of I talked to this coach, and they had, I don't know, 20 diplomas in the background. And I thought, to some level, that gives you a lot of credibility, right? It potentially creates a lot of trust in the client who talks to you and has some reassurance that, oh, this person seems to know what they're doing. They're well trained. I'm in good hands. I'm safe, right? But on the other end of the spectrum, it can also lead to, oh, this person is so much better than me, or they know so much more than me. And it can really lead to a imbalance in that relationship. It's difficult to meet someone at eye level who's presenting like that. And so you can never be quite sure whether this is ego that might be in the way of a fruitful eye-to-eye equal coaching relationship, or whether this is going to serve the client because they know they're in a safe place because there's someone who's really well trained.
Yeah, good point.
I think this is such a wicked question. This is the kind of questions I really love. And I was just rereading the wording exactly, which was, how do I get my ego out of the way when I coach? This for me is like one of those subjects where the responsibility, having spoken about responsibilities in my previous questions, where the responsibility of the coach really comes in. I think I see it this way, at least, as a coach, I think of myself as having a responsibility of staying on top of my own development, whether that's through getting my own coaching, through getting therapy, through getting supervision, because I think, our ego is attached to us, and it's like one of those things that it's a relationship that kind of develops through life. It's not like we ever get to a stage where we completely get rid of our ego. So in terms of how do I manage that within coaching, for me, several things come to mind. First of all, I think, or maybe I'm just that kind of person, but it really helps to like read a bit about the ego and kind of, understand what the ego is and kind of maybe a little bit of theories around it. And then the other thing that you said in our opening is about, presence. I think, one of the most important aspects of managing our egos in coaching sessions is having that presence and kind of being in touch with ourselves and our responses to our client, and kind of flagging things like, is this me, or is this them? Is this my agenda? Where is this response in me coming from? And like, I think one of the key ways I try and manage my own ego in those moments when I kind of maybe notice it flaring up or something triggers me and I'm like, I'm not sure, am I responding in the best way to the client, is always remembering that phrase. And I think this is something from Carl Rogers potentially, and I just found it so immensely powerful and useful, is to just remind ourselves, it's not about me, this is about them. So whenever there is something and I want to respond in a certain way, and I have that presence to be like, hang on, Nikki, wait a minute, is this really right? I go like, just remember, this is not about you, this is about them. What response would serve them best?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and I couldn't underline more what you said around what is my response and what is my reaction, because our ego will get triggered. A client didn't respond to the question as well as you wanted to, or they ignored your question and they answered a different question. or they just kind of kept talking, or they, whatever it is, it's easy for us as coaches to get defensive or to get frustrated or to get impatient, and to then ask ourselves, what's going on for me and why is that going on for me? Is that going on for me because I generally am a bit impatient, or I don't know, maybe it's because my dad, for example, is incredibly impatient. So sometimes when I get impatient, I know it has nothing to do with the clients. That's all to me. That's just like what I grew up with. And if I then get that out of the way and put that into my box and put the lid on, and that box will jump up and down and it will make a lot of noise. And I'm like, no, that's my stuff. That's my stuff in the box right there. And I'm keeping that in the box as much as I can, right? It takes constant effort. It takes constant monitoring and awareness to keep your stuff in the box if you really want to tune in, right? And if I then still notice some frustration or some impatience, I'm like, oh, this part is created from you and me in relation. That's really interesting that this emotion is coming up in me. And I might choose to work with that. I might choose to share that. I might choose to give a voice to that, because I know I have my stuff in the box, and that's not what it was, right? It's not the dispute with my partner yesterday, or that other client that, criticized me on this or that level, and now it's coming back. It's like, this is something that is present here and generated between the two of us. And then it matters, right? My own stuff, my own ego, that's not most likely not going to serve the client.
Yeah, I think the inner work is so important. The supervision, therapy, potentially having your own coach, a space. I think like a space where you can discuss these things, where you can actually say like, well, this is what came up, this is what happened, and this is how I felt.
Mm-hmm. Somebody from the outside who can give you some feedback on it, and I'd be curious about how you reacted when you couldn't recognize it because it's so you.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's, I think that the more we coach, because all these things that happen, right, they're not straightforward. Sometimes, even if you do a really good job, a client might just decide to not continue paying, or they might decide to, to make a complaint, right? So many things can happen that can actually trigger things. Mm-hmm. And, you need a space to talk about these things.
Yeah. And when that then happens, somebody stops paying you or gives you a piece of critical feedback. It's such a good example, right? Because how many coaches then go, oh, I'm not good enough, or, it has something to do with me, or am I a good enough coach, or, oh, what's happening? Or you get defensive, or you get aggressive, or like, if you manage to get all of that ego out of the way, you start getting curious about what's going on for your client.
Yeah. I remember, I don't think I've shared this publicly at all, but I remember, I think around 5 years ago, I was coaching someone, and it's a 3-month agreement. And after a month, like halfway, she stopped and she said, well, I'm not going to pay you. Right. And she wrote me a long message saying like, you know what, I didn't get a lot out of it. And before I had my conversation with my coach, I was really down. And I said to my wife, you know what, maybe this is not for me. Like I started thinking like, you know what, maybe I'm not good enough. Like I just took that message and I thought, wow, if someone actually writes that, they're probably right. And I remember actually bringing that up with my coach, and the coach said, well, tell me more about this relationship. Like, what have you guys done? And, what's happened? And then, and then I got to see that actually, well, a lot of this wasn't me. It was something happened there. And we actually, we met in person. I ran into her like a week or 2 weeks later, and then she apologized. She said like, there was a lot going on and all that stuff. And then she ended up actually keeping her word, and she made the payment, which is really interesting because in that moment I was in my own head. I was like, oh my God, this is the end of the world. Mm-hmm. That's it. Like they found out, that I'm not a good coach. And I think, it's so easy to like, and by the way, like I don't think sometimes like, people talk about imposter syndrome, right? I think, imposter syndrome actually has a really good place in our profession. I think in any profession, like for me, it usually indicates that mean, for me, it hasn't really come up in the last 2 years, last 4 years maybe. But when it would come up at the beginning, it would actually indicate that, hey, maybe you know what, like you need to spend a bit more time here, right? If I used to think like maybe I'm not good enough, or I would just say, well, okay, well, what are some things I need to spend more attention towards? And I think it's very easy to just say, well, we put our ego aside. I don't know. I don't know if that's like a separate conversation, but I think often it's very easy to say that I'm a good coach. So I'm, whatever is coming is their own stuff. But sometimes actually putting your ego aside allows you to actually see that, you know what, maybe there's some truth in there, and I can take some of this and improve. Like I knew that from that, the lesson I learned is just to communicate better in terms of, hey, what could potentially happen in this relationship.
Yeah, I think we could definitely have a full episode at least on imposter syndrome, and I think we should. we haven't really covered it yet, but like for me, the main point is still, and you kind of highlight that with that too, is what are you missing when you're engaged in your own shit? When your own stuff comes up and you're getting defensive or frustrated, or you're asking yourself whether you're good enough or whatever it is. What are you missing? Because you're not paying attention to your client. Your attention is focused on yourself, so I think that's not fair, because the coaching is about them and it's not about you. And some of it is, of course, in relation, but I think if we let our own stuff to get involved too much, then we're doing the client a disservice. And Nikki, I love that you brought the question back to its exact reading, right? What can I actually do to not let my ego get in the way? So do your own work is something that already emerged strongly today, right? Create self-awareness as much as possible. Being able to decide, is this my own stuff, or is this something that's generated here? Is this going to be useful for the client, or is this useful for me in some way? And if you drop all of the stuff that's useful for me and not for the client, in order to do that, you need to be able to have that level of awareness, right? So Julie talks often about, she went to India a bunch of times to go on retreats, to really do the personal work. Robin Short, I had on this podcast as well, he talks about just being really attuned with what's going on for you. So that means taking a couple of minutes, at least, before every session, to just kind of sit there and pay attention to what's going on for you, right? What kind of thoughts, feelings, emotions are floating around? What's happening in your life right now? Regular supervision is one of those things, right? Regular reflective spaces, supervision probably being the most effective reflective space. But you can also create reflective spaces for yourself. If you do that with a colleague or a peer, even with a friend, there's somebody who can reflect something back, somebody that can point to your blind spots. Record sessions if it's appropriate and contracted, obviously. Listen back to them. Develop more awareness about where your interventions are coming from. Is it from a position of ego or from a position of service? And sometimes it's difficult to draw the line. Sometimes it's difficult to distinguish where one ends and the other one begins. So that's a couple of things on the top of my head that I can think of. What can you actually do to not let that happen?
Yeah, really nice. I really like that. One kind of thing that it just reminds me as well, it's just in that process is, as when these things come up, even in a session, is also just to remember to have compassion for your own humanity, not to now turn that into something really, really negative and beat down on yourself and that kind of thing, but just to notice it, like I'm someone who really enjoys mindfulness and all of that. So it's just learning also then how to interact kindly with yourself, with your ego and the things that come up, but bracket all of that, flag it for after, and maybe bring it up in your supervision session, but really develop that filter to notice it quite quickly, put it to one side and bring yourself back into the space with your client.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sebastian, any last words?
No, I think we've talked about the most important parts, and I think it would be probably useful to have a podcast episode about supervision. I can imagine, we were, coaches that are now formally getting qualified, they probably get exposed to it. And maybe they experience it as part of their coaching program. I think also a lot of coaches probably have no clue what it is. I know that in the first 2 years, I didn't come across supervision, and the only thing that I saw is that I could hire a coach, and a lot of coaches are actually not really trained in supervision. They can sometimes create that space. They can create that space, and that's also useful. But I think actually just having creating a few questions around supervision.
Oh yeah. I think the main one is, do I need supervision? So we'll definitely have that episode, because many of you will know I feel strongly about that. But yeah, it's fantastic in order to get the ego out of the way. If you have a supervisor who's trained well, I would say, because as you say, there's so many supervisors who are really just coaches for coaches, and that's different, right? So coming in to a relationship, looking for that is going to be really helpful for your clients as well, right? Your clients want to engage with other people in their world without having their ego get in the way. It's not just something that coaches do. For coaches, particularly important, but like any lawyer, any accountant will probably do a better job if they get their ego out of the way. Although for some, I guess you could argue that you probably will want to expand your ego if you're, I don't know, a movie star or something like that. But even then, I would say, don't let your ego get in the way, especially during the time that you're working, because if you let your ego get in the way, especially when you're acting, it's not going to work. I mean, for some, it works because you get hired because they want you to be your ego. But really, when you're acting, that's the non plus ultra of getting the ego out of the way, because you literally need to adopt another one. So, but hey, that goes well beyond. We opened a lot of doors here. At this point, we're going to have to close it down. Thank you guys so much. I'd love to hear some stories from people who might be watching this or listening to this of how their ego might have gotten in the way. I'd love to see some stories in the comments. And maybe what are you doing to not let that happen moving forward? I would love to hear what other people's experiences are.
Yeah, I love that too. Really interesting.
Cool.
Share.
Great. Thank you guys. I'll see you another time, and I'll thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for being with us today. I appreciate your commitment to learning and growing as a coach. Just a few things before you go. First of all, we're doing this for you, so if there's anything you'd like us to talk about, do send us a question. Secondly, we're not doing this for profit, so we rely on your support to help us reach as many coaches as we can. So if you can send this episode to a friend or tell a fellow coach about what we're doing here, maybe you can subscribe or leave us a review, or even support us on Patreon. That would be amazing. And lastly, you can find us across all major platforms. So whether you like to watch, or you like to listen, or you like to download episodes and listen to it in your car while you're driving through somewhere with no internet, you can do so too. And that's it from us. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time.